It's been a while since I last wrote a sonnet. Never mind, I will write one now. A sonnet for childhood, where childhood is nothing but a small black dot colliding with the still train that I am, drawn to some fatal, dim trajectory. The sonnet keeps us company, like a weird little man trailing along behind us every moment of the day, thinking of the things we cannot or do not say, and all within the space of 14 lines. No more, no less. Lines in which a Pessoa might find a place, his place, her place, you get the gist, as if he cared to know, as if you cared what lies ahead for you, or me, or him.
It's been a while since I took a poem for a walk. A few years ago, I used to do this every day. A 3x5-inch index card, the poem scribbled onto it, held in my hand the way one might hold a child's hand while leading them along the pavement. You with your own confused or unsettled self, and the poem setting off on a little adventure together. And what is that adventure, you might ask? It is perhaps the only adventure some of us truly care for, the adventure of discovering what lies within as well as beyond ourselves.
When I was learning my poetry liturgy, 100 poems that took me about 4 years in total to memorize, the adventure was simply that of walking along, repeating each line of each poem until all the lines held together in here and in here, the whole thing carried along in one's heart and mind so that the poem might be called upon whenever we wanted to connect with it. The lovely thing about learning a poem, as well as going for a walk with a poem, is that it quite naturally becomes this deliciously associative activity, all sorts of connections being made as we walk along with our poem. It could happen, of course, with any piece of language, poetry or not, although if one is going to surrender introspectively to oneself, to one's inner worlds in this DIY fashion, I find it best, for my purposes, to do so with poetry.
Walking alongside a poem, repeating its lines over and over again, certain expressions leap out at you and call forth ideas that can only be had because you are in the space of this poem rather than that of a short story or a novel or a song. This is one of the deepest joys of taking a poem for a walk. You and the poem having all the time in the world to stay with and notice whatever it is that is calling to your receptive attention. It is the best kind of therapy, I find, in the sense of that Greek word therapeia, denoting a form of attentive service, attending to what is before us in a caring or careful way, allowing the smallest parts of our being to be seen, held, and maybe even momentarily restored. The first point of lingering in this poem arrives for me with that description of childhood as nothing but a small black dot. Meagre offerings here for the psychoanalyst, we might say. At this moment in human history, childhood is usually framed as something of an interpretive sinkhole, a zone where every partially raised voice, every moment spent in our rooms as children licking our wounds, is presented back to us by therapists and the wider culture as a trauma template for all that we are likely to most struggle with in our lives, as well as everything we are struggling with right now.
The orthodox line, as we know, is that whatever we can remember having happened to us in childhood must be treated as a correlation finding exercise, an attempt to justify who we are and how we function in the world, because of this, which, understandably, for all of us, soon becomes a kind of consoling fiction, a private myth that we can return to for orientation rather than truth. Which is why I find it bracing to have Pessoa close the door on all of that, or rather, wrap the whole caboodle of the past into a single full stop, where memory and its supposed explanatory force are usually given hours, if not years, of airtime.
The key text for all of this is Philippe Aries's Centuries of Childhood, which makes the unsettling claim that our experience of infancy and childhood, far from being the core site of egoic formation, is instead a somewhat recent cultural concoction.
Arias shows how earlier European societies moved children rapidly into the adult world with little sense of having a protected inner life or a developmental narrative that might need to be tracked retrospectively. Only with the rise of modern bourgeois families, new forms of schooling, and an equally insistent inclination to supervise the young did childhood acquire its contemporary aura of fragility and depth. Viviana Zelitzer, in her book Pricing the Priceless Child, extends this argument by describing how children were gradually reimagined as modernity gathered pace in the 19th and early 20th centuries. In this era, children became economically useless but emotionally priceless, sealing our modern expectation that our childhood must serve, perhaps can only serve, as this privileged site of existential meaning, vulnerability, and biographical anchoring. What emerges when we read Arias and Zelitzer is not the timeless stage of the self, but rather a historically contingent project in which the child becomes the symbolic bearer of value. Value, also innocence, as well as a good deal of interpretive weight. A figure whose past we scrutinize only because our culture has taught us that identity must always have an origin story associated with it, a master key, as opposed to some characterological template or a set of generalizable archetypal ego patterns, such as those we find described in the Enneagram.
The problem with this framework is that instead of orienting us to the present, it often pulls us away from this moving carriage of the self that is once more encountering today's life tracks, today's conditions, all of which tend to matter a great deal more than the shadow theatre we reconstruct behind ourselves in therapy and biographical narratives. Even in Pessoa's case, where the engine of his being seems to be idling on a forgotten piece of track, unclaimed by any childhood scripts.
A poem is perhaps simply just the term that we use to describe that small bird which hatches in the heart or the soul, thereafter flying into the branches of the mind, carrying some inconsequential but still highly charged piece of authentic language in its tiny beak, hoping to nest inside us for a while, if not forever. In this sense, the poem is really the closest thing we have to the here and now, which is to say, the furthest distance away from our childhood that we can get. This is also perhaps the most frustrating position from which to view our lives, because the here and now is often unpredictable and unpleasant. So no wonder then that we might prefer to focus our attention, as well as our imagination, on whatever we can dredge up from back then or from what is still to come. It's good to know one's place, and a poem, especially a short poem, gives us a very definite place in which to live. As Fernando says, the poem in which he currently lives has 14 lines to play with, and that can be, for both writer and reader, a settling constraint. When we read a poem, if the first half of it is unsatisfying, there is always the chance that the latter half may lift as well as fail us. Although the point is not really the outcome of any poem, but rather its charged significance, which is only really apparent to those of us to whom it speaks in the fullest sense of that word. This is also how it goes for us human animals. I am largely inconsequential to everyone I passed when out and about, but equally to my therapy clients, apart from as a paid witness and confidant. I am inconsequential to former friends and partners, to previous workmates and schoolmates. I am inconsequential to you, whoever you are watching this video, and you to me. Why should it be any different with a poem? The poem itself, Homecoming, this poem, was written 10 years after the suicide of Pessoa's friend Mario de Sacarneiro, also suggesting perhaps a more terminal homecoming for Pessoa. Pessoa in 1935 was 47 years old, but was already slipping away. Alcohol and tobacco had been his closest friends and companions through his loner as well as fairly lonely adult existence. Pessoa in this way is a very modern figure, we could say, a kind of weirdo everyman, inwardly divided, existentially fatigued, spiritually restless, as well as painfully self-aware, as if always listening for some faint interior signal that would never quite show itself. 300 days after penning Homecoming, Pessoa would be dead and buried with very little fanfare, his life's work, including this poem, kept with everything else he had written in a large, disordered chest of scribbles in his room. On the manuscript of this poem, Pessoa wrote "end of book," perhaps imagining this utterance as his last word and testament, a final message in a bottle sent from whatever sensibility, whatever unsettled soul lived within him, forward in time to us. In my translation of the poem, I have decided to leave the word Pessoa in the final few lines as it stands in Portuguese. The word Pessoa means person in English and was also, of course, the name of the poet, Fernando Pessoa. If you know anything about Pessoa, you will know that he had a number of issues with his own Pessoa or Pessoas, which is to say, with his own personhood. Pessoa's trouble with his personhood seems to have something to do with shame, not the simple shame of an error or a social misstep, but the deeper, more structural shame of someone who suspects that the inner flavor of their being is somehow at odds with the tastes or preferred register of other people's lives. Shame thus acts as an engine of self-dispersal, a feeling that the self we have been given is perhaps too inward, too steeped in melancholic humors, or maybe just too attuned to moods that cannot be brightened or heightened on command, and so must be hidden or repressed. In response to the shame, Pessoa edges away from himself, generating other voices, other temperaments, other vantage points through which he might speak without being forced to confront the rawness and incoherence of his own interior world, which is also what I think the last few lines of the poem are perhaps signaling to us. What makes this poem a koan for me, as opposed to just 14 lines of verse, lies in the potential it has to not only make me feel a certain way, but also in its enigmatic power. A koan does not illuminate by explanation, but rather by putting us in contact with our own ongoing bewilderment.
For what does it truly mean to live as a human animal, if not to live somewhat or even totally bewildered and disoriented, unsteadied by the strangeness of our own existence, our own half-formed intuitions, as well as that fundamental inability we all have to make our human sensibility and animal biology cohere in any settled way. It is in the space of bewilderment that the poem does its real work, taking us for a walk without offering simple solutions, inviting us to discover what might in time reveal itself simply through the act of ambling along with a poem in our pocket and a few new ideas presenting themselves to our minds.
And now my biggest fear is not the dying. My biggest fear is that I'll stop trying to be the man I am supposed to be. We take life seriously, laugh in the face of death. Yeah, we take life seriously, laugh in the face of death. We take life seriously, laugh in the face of death.